Hello, Psychology 211. Today I'm here to briefly discuss Chapter 8 and then Chapter 9. Chapter 8 really talks about biology. This is something, I'll be honest, I'm not very good at. But it really talks about the ways that we have looked at classifying humans and their differences, and that most of history, what you'll see, is that scientists classified people based on their skin color, for example. And what we have found out over the years is that that's not a very effective way to categorize individuals, mainly because skin color varies so much, and then what to say of facial structure or weight, and there's ethnicity, for example. So really what chapters 8 and 9 boil down to is that when looking at differences amongst humans, the best way to look at it is through a cultural lens as opposed to a racial lens. Our chapter starts off talking about racial profiling, which you all, I'm certain, know a lot about. If you've watched the news even for 5 minutes in the last, say, couple of years, you know a lot about this, as we've had so many police shootings. Some of you have even shared some experiences with me where you actually have been victims of racial profiling yourself. So you know that even though we still, from a scientific perspective, don't classify humans by their skin color, there are many places in which we're still categorized that way. Our book talks a little bit about terrorism as well. Again, that's a concept I know that you all are familiar with very much. So as science has evolved from looking at people, biological diversity in a racial way, they now look at understanding specific differences. You know, those typical or traditional racial characteristics were thought to be mostly determined by heredity, and that scientists thought that they were not only hereditary, but they stayed stable throughout time. And what the new method shows us is that, in fact, that's not the case. That based just on Darwin's natural selection concepts, that over the years, organisms that are more fit to survive in the climate are able to survive while others die out, and that we tend to adapt to the environment in order to survive. And they talk about skin color, specifically melanin in the skin, as one of the ways that humans have adapted. So, for example, people traditionally from very tropical countries may have very dark skin or more melanin so that they can handle the more direct sunlight without damaging their skin and causing harm. And then people that live sort of outside the tropics tend to have lighter skin. And it's interesting when you look at people such as East Asians who have migrated from India and Pakistan over the last years, those that have moved to very wet places, cloudy places like the United Kingdom, you'll see that they sometimes suffer from something called rickets, which is really just a lack of vitamin D, mainly because they're not getting enough sunlight, and their skin is in fact adapted to have more. So we know that biology can adapt so that humans can survive much better. So our book in both chapters really drives home the point that culture, not race, explains differences in what we see amongst people. One of the things, and one of the reasons why we talked a little bit about stereotypes this week, is that a common misconception around the world is that black people are better athletes than white people, for example. And what we know is that, quite frankly, athletic performance is really not because of genetics, that it may be because of culture. And what you'll see is there's some traditionally black-dominated sports and more white-dominated sports. So, for example, you don't see a whole lot of black athletes that are golfers or tennis players. This is why the Williams sisters, for example, were such wonderful stars, because they came out of a very poor area of Los Angeles and have been a huge success. And one of the reasons they talk about culture with athletic ability is that if you're from an area where you have country clubs, you've got golf courses, tennis courts, and access to things, tennis lessons and golf lessons that maybe kids from lower income families don't have access to. And they refer in our book to that as less access to sports resources. So if you happen to grow up with a family that had a little more money to support your sport, then maybe your chances are a little bit better in certain areas. So they talk about how culture impacts athletic abilities and even other things. They talk a lot about cultural bias with intelligence testing. We've seen throughout history that there are certain groups of kids and individuals who don't do as well in intelligence testing, not because they're not as intelligent, but because the tests are not consistent with their cultural background. Our book talks about bilingual children who tend to test low. And these are children that are fluent in 2 languages, so obviously they're intelligent enough to do that. They also talked about an incident in history during World War II in which they did intelligence testing on African Americans. And what they found is that African Americans from the northern part of the United States outperformed those from southern states. And again, what they find is poorer access to better education meant that people from the southern states, that African American people from the South, did not perform as well as their northern counterparts did. So what we see over and over again is that access is more of a problem than intelligence, or in fact heredity is. So one of the things that we've done to address that is something called affirmative action. You are all familiar with this because it's been a hot topic for many years in this country. And those programs are really there to try to recruit more diversity, to allow in students who may have not had the benefit of an education that's as good as some of their white counterparts. But as you know, affirmative action laws have been challenged all across the country, and many of them have been overturned. So affirmative action may have been one way to sort of account for that lack of cultural access, if you will. Now, as we move into Chapter 9, which is race and racism, this chapter really starts with a reminder that race as a way to classify biological differences in humans has been discredited. That in fact, our differences are about cultural constructs. So that race is a matter of cultural categories and organizations, not biological reality. But that being said, even though science continues to say that it's the cultural concepts that really change the way we are as individuals, we still want to classify people. And our tendency to classify people is really based on their appearance, skin color, shape of the nose, shape of the eyes, for example. And that even though we've had legislation over the past many years to sort of impact or help, things like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, while those things have been helpful in creating social equity, we still have a long way to go in terms of classifying people really just based on color. And as you saw when we talked about the census, I believe it was last week, that people feel like they fit in more than one category, and the census has been relatively slow to catch up with that. So as the years go on and we identify as more than one ethnic background, it continues to be a challenge to categorize us. One of the interesting concepts they talked about in this book was something I'd really never thought of before, and that is the concept of hypodescent. So that if you have a child who is biracial, half white, half black, half white, half Hispanic, whatever the case might be, that they always have to identify as something. And one way that they would identify themselves tends to be, most of the time, with the minority part of that relationship. So if you're half Hispanic, half white, many of those children will later identify themselves as Hispanic. And our book talks about that as being a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know that they really give an example of, or really reason for why that happens, but for those of you that may be in that category yourselves, think of the reasons how and why you've chosen to identify yourself as black or white. And they actually use Obama as a really interesting way as an example of somebody, his mother is white, his father was African American, or really maybe even just African in this case, and he calls himself or he identifies himself as black. So it was an interesting concept that I'd never really thought, but that does seem to be the case, that those children tend to identify with their minority parent. And they also talked about another interesting phenomenon, which is sort of that non-white minority identification, so based on sex. So if my mother is white and my father is black, then I should more likely identify with my mother as white because she's my mother and we're the same sex. And vice versa would be true with father and son. But I thought that was another kind of unusual conversation that I'd never really thought of before. And again, we talked about the census already, and you all have seen the government's attempt to sort of catch up with the way we identify ourselves ethnically, and that it's been a challenge. And some of you really felt you fit great into some of those categories, and others of you are still feeling like maybe there are other categories that you still belong in. But our book talks about the rate of the choice of other race or other than races has tripled since 1980. So that will give you an idea of the change, and again, in that shift in a multicultural, or towards a multicultural society that we have today. One example they gave in our book that I thought was interesting, when we talk about countries that seem to have people that all look alike, we tend to think, at least I do, of Asian countries. Japan was the example they used. When you look at the Japanese people, they all pretty much look the same. They're very homogeneous. But even in a country like Japan, there are racial and ethnic differences. They talk about a group of people called the Burakumin, who were descendants of a very, very low class of worker hundreds of years ago, that to this day, even Japan, they are discriminated against and live in their own neighborhoods and sometimes even have the same trades. So it's interesting to see a society that's very similar physically treat a group of people who actually look the same as them physically, but have a different lineage and a different background. So that's something kind of to think about, how each culture defines differences and majority and majority. Until next time, I will see you again.